It was an incredible day. What a scene. Michigan fans outnumbering Alabama fans, but Alabama was loud there when they were making their run in the second half, and an incredible environment. So let's talk about the Rose Bowl a little bit as we sit here a few days later. What impressed you the most about Michigan's performance as you rewatch that game and as you think more about it?
It's that for most of the game, they completely dominated the trenches on both sides of the ball. Now, coming into the game, Alabama's offensive line, I said this earlier in the year, they weren't what they have been. They were a tick or two below, and really in a lot of ways, given that their center couldn't snap the football, maybe several ticks below what we typically see out of them. But they did get better throughout the second half of the year. They're still huge. They're massive, really up front on both sides of the ball. And for the most part in that game, Michigan completely owned the line of scrimmage, which is not something that, it's not to say I thought that Alabama would dominate them, not by any stretch, but I thought this was a heavyweight fight. This is a prize fight between two of the most iconic brands in college football. But outside of the miscues on special teams, outside of some self-inflicted wounds with penalties and whatnot, I thought that Michigan completely dominated the line of scrimmage. And even the thing that struck out to me the most on rewatch was I think that was the best game that secondary has played all season long. I know not quite as they've seen arguably maybe a better offense in Ohio State, but those guys looked fast. They were flying around to the ball. Rod Moore was incredible. Josh Wallace played his best game at Michigan so far. Will Johnson was his typical, elite self. Those guys were terrific. And I think that when you put all that together, in addition to the obvious stuff that we've discussed here in the last few days, that's when you're talking about, we'll get to Washington here, but when you talk about what it's going to take to beat a team, an explosive passing offense like Washington, that we just watched Michigan's secondary play its best game of the year is extremely encouraging heading into that game on Monday night.
Yeah, no doubt. It is going to be different. I agree with you because, partly because Washington's offensive line is better than Alabama's. They won the Joe Moore Award, so the pressure may not be there as much. You may have to cover longer, and Washington has better receivers. But you're right. I think rewatching the game, the secondary stands out, and the defensive line gets a ton of credit, deservedly so. I mean, 6 sacks and a bunch of negative plays and a bunch of stops for like 0 and 1 yard gains as well, which are underrated because people kind of look at the some of the stats and they don't see those as much. But I thought that was great. But the secondary, I mean, the way Rod Moore played with some of the open field tackles he made, defending Kendrick Law on the deep ball there, the way he positioned himself, absolute blanketed in coverage. Just the leverage this Michigan defense played with was fantastic. I agree with you on Josh Wallace. I thought he was great. Tackles, making really strong tackles. The safeties, you lose Makari Page there in the second half, and Quentin Johnson makes a huge play, jarring the ball loose on Jalen Milroe. And, Keon Sabb comes in. He only had 5 snaps, but it felt like he was around the ball the entire time, every single time he was in there. A couple corner blitzes from Will Johnson. And I remember the corner blitz from Jamon Green in the TCU game a year ago. There's no safety that rotates over. It goes for a big play. This time, I mean, everything was on point. Quentin Johnson rotated over on one, Keon Sabb on another. So those guys played incredible football. And Jalen Milroe said coming into the game that, because he was asked by our friend Isaiah Hull, hey, Marvin Harrison Jr. said that Michigan mixes up coverages better than anybody. There were some things he had never seen before in the Michigan-Ohio State game. And Jalen Milroe said it won't be anything I haven't seen in the SEC. Well, I think it was something maybe he hasn't seen in the SEC. And I know they played Georgia and other good teams, but that may have been the best defense that Alabama had faced all year. Certainly the best performance by one that they did. Alabama didn't have a drive longer than 55 yards. The only, the touchdown early on when they really couldn't get much going came off of the muff punt. So defense was great, and you got to credit Jesse Minter. Also rewatching and really, thought of it during the game as well, but just the way Michigan mixed things up offensively when it came to breaking tendency. I mean, you had a couple gadget plays when you needed them, the throwback, the great catch by J.J. McCarthy. But I thought Sharon Moore and Jim Harbaugh and the entire offensive staff put together an incredible performance and really put these guys in great positions. And one of the things they did was they used 2 tight ends less. I think Alabama was prepared to face AJ Barner and Colston Loveland, but Michigan goes with a little bit more 11 personnel in a little bit more matchups. And I think, AB, you and I had a conversation, I think a month and a half ago, coming off of, I don't remember exactly which game it was, but we were just saying how Sharon Moore is so good and seems better than maybe the coordinators in the past at getting Michigan players in favorable matchups. And that's what they did in this game. It was Michigan's slot receivers and running backs against Alabama's linebackers. 6 times in coverage, Alabama's 2 starting inside linebackers, Jahad Campbell and Deontay Lawson, were targeted. 6 catches, 82 yards, 2 touchdowns. Roman Wilson, the last one, Blake Corum on that first touchdown where they snuck him out. What a job by the coaching staff.
It was a great job by the coaching staff. And it's also, I have to think of a way to put this without sounding like a know-it-all, but it was very affirming to me to watch them go out and do the things that I thought they were going to have to do to get this Alabama defense off guard. You know, the misdirection. I mean, there was misdirection or some kind of motion seemingly before every offensive snap. They had those guys, you know, when those athletes, again, I won't argue that Alabama has better athletes. I mean, from a pure skill set perspective, maybe, but you know, when those guys do have that type of advantage, you have to, a split second that you make them have to think about it can be the difference between a play that goes for 3 yards or a play that goes for 13. And I thought that was not their best executed offensive game of the year, but in terms of the best called game, the best game plan, it's right up there. I mean, Dallas Turner, I think, had the 1 sack in the game, and that was Alabama's only sack. Didn't really hear Chris Braswell's name at all. You know, a couple of other guys made plays, but the offensive line, outstanding as well. I mean, it was going to take their best game, and I think that was their best game of the year, which was, you love to see that after a month of preparation. So for me, I mean, I think it was the idea that this Michigan coaching staff, and this is, again, something that goes into Monday as well, you know, they're going to find ways to win by any means necessary. It's not going to look the same week to week. And people thought that Michigan was just kind of try and line up and go heavy and run the ball down Alabama's throat, because that's the perception of what this Michigan offense is under Jim Harbaugh and Sharon Moore. But, you know, Tyler Morris, Samaj Morgan. No, Samaj didn't have the best game in the world, but those guys needed to be X factors, and they were. And then at the end, when you needed someone to make a play, you just hand it off to number 2 and let him do something magical with it, like he did in the Ohio State game, like he did in that overtime period. So in terms of how it was called, how it was executed, A++ for Jesse Minter, A+ for Sharon Moore. I mean, those guys are the key to everything. And I know a lot of the conversation, there are still people that are trying to steer the conversation away from Michigan's success being legitimate post 2020. The biggest difference between pre-2020 Michigan and post-2020 Michigan is that it has 2 of the best coordinators in the entire sport right now. And before then, it didn't. And to me, that might be the biggest factor in all this.
Yeah. I mean, the changes they made, the things that they did, the talent they were able to accumulate, the quarterback play. I mean, there are so many other reasons other than really none of this was brought up over the last month, but now that they're in the national championship and even more in the national spotlight, you're obviously getting some of that conversation, but it's total BS. And yeah, I mean, the biggest thing might've been the defensive change that they made, changing philosophies and going to more of an NFL system. And we can talk about what we expect out of the defense in a little bit in the Washington game, but man, the fact that defense gave the Michigan offense, which had only 2 first downs in the first 25 minutes of the second half, a chance to win the game or tie the game at the end, and then go win the game in overtime, really speaks to how good how good of a performance the defense put together. And you got to feel good for Jesse Minter after what the TCU game was a year ago. I talked to him in the locker room after, and you could just see it, how happy he was, and he deserves to be. But they got a big challenge ahead as well. So a little bit of Rose Bowl talk there. I know people are still kind of basking a little bit and looking forward to Houston, the game against Washington on Monday night.